warm welcome to all of you tonight to the RCCGlasgow pop-up, which, as you can see by looking around you, is a temporary exhibition which we are mounting for 2 weeks over the course of the Glasgow COP, partly to profile the work of the Rachel Carson Centre, which is the world's leading interdisciplinary research centre for environmental researchers in social sciences and humanities, but also to bring perspectives to the COP that aren't necessarily from the hard sciences, and to bring a slightly more holistic understanding of all the perspectives that we in academia, and indeed those beyond academia, are using in tackling the climate crisis. So on the walls around you, you will see contributions from, I think, 17 different members of the Carson Network, or Carson Fellows. And I hope you take the time this evening to look at those, or indeed, if you can't tonight, to come back in the next 2 weeks and to view the exhibition and the film, which we have playing in the space every day. It's a pleasure to welcome SGSAH here tonight as our sponsors for this event, and to have three amazing speakers, some local, some very much more global, who have all come to Glasgow to contribute to the COP in different ways. So I'm delighted to introduce Samantha Walton, who is a senior lecturer, reader in English literature at Bath Spa University in England. Sam is the author of a new book which is just coming out called The Nature Cure, which is very much, and Sam will go on to explain more about this, which is about the way in which nature has been used and is used to as a kind of wellness and lifestyle component. And I think Sam takes quite a critical view of that, and she'll be talking more about that. We also have Lewis Coenen-Rowe, who's from Creative Carbon Scotland. Lewis and Creative Carbon Scotland work with the creative arts in Scotland and with different types of creative practice and creative engagement to look at climate change and decarbonisation in Scotland. And I've been going for a couple of years now, and are really starting to make a big impact, both in the Scottish art scene, but also actually in the Scottish policy world as well, which really shows the worth of those approaches. And also we are very delighted to have Naveeda Khan. Naveeda is Professor of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University in the US. Originally from Bangladesh, and Naveeda is here to share her knowledge about her work more generally, but also her perspectives on research in the Global South as they contribute to COP. Now, I'm not going to say any more myself this evening. I'm going to hand over to our guests to just speak briefly about their engagement with climate change and what they are here doing in Glasgow. Please don't be perturbed by me passing a phone back and forth. Our radio mic is broken tonight, so we're having to use the phone for the audio track, and it will be mixed in afterwards. So thank you very much for coming once again, and I'll now hand over first of all to Sam to introduce herself and talk a little bit about her work.
Take the phone, do I? Brilliant. Hello everyone, really nice to see you all. Yes, as Dom said, I am a reader in modern literature, which sounds like a hobby. It's actually a job. I work on modern literature, but from the perspective of what we call environmental humanities. So it's exploring the ways in which humanities subjects, also art subjects, can contribute to kind of cultural thinking around environmental crisis, environmental justice, thinking about the kinds of space that are opened up in humanities and arts work that maybe aren't opened up in quite the same way in the sciences. So at Bath Spa, I'm involved in and currently running our research centre for environmental humanities, which is just this incredible group of researchers and students. We do have biologists, we do have scientists, we've also got theatre makers, fine artists, people in dance and history, philosophy, ethics, religion, literature, people like me, all trying to share a space, I suppose, to work out what it is our disciplines do on their own to help contribute to thinking and feeling our way through environmental crisis. But also what they can do collectively as well. And that's the really difficult work, I think, is to kind of work out what an interdisciplinary space might look like. What are some of the assumptions in our discipline that aren't shared or maybe are translated differently in others. And then to talk to outside the university, to connect with students, to connect with the public, bearing in mind the public isn't just like one kind of category of people, right? So that's my professional work. As Dom said, I also write. And my most recent book, Everybody Needs Beauty: In Search of the Nature Cure, came about really as a process of connecting my own kind of quite unexamined romantic tendency to like wander out into fields and woods and parks whenever I'm feeling really shit and come back feeling a little bit better. I was really interested in that from a personal point of view, but also as somebody who kind of has worked a little bit in public policy world, kind of gone that way a bit and then kind of retreated quickly. I saw how that was becoming quite a major discourse in city planning, in thinking about education, in thinking about kind of alternatives that can exist within the National Health Service to create alternative forms of support for people experiencing mental ill health or poor well-being. And I wanted to explore that as a social phenomenon. I wanted to explore that kind of critically, thinking about some of the social conditions maybe that people are suffering from. You know, what are we running away from when we go to nature? And why do we think of nature as somewhere separate from where we already are? I wanted to explore all of those sorts of questions, not to sort of like blow up the nature cure or say that, you know, it's absolutely bogus, but to politicize it and to think about that relationship in a more radical way, you know, to work out what kind of society we really want, how we can involve healing or kind of caring about one another's well-being in a more collective way in our everyday lives. So I hope that works as an introduction, but yeah, I'll pass it on.
It's quite nice. It's like passing the speaking stick or something. So yeah, I'm Lewis. I work at Creative Co-op in Scotland, which is a charity working on the role of arts and culture in addressing climate change. So our focus is on climate change, but we also work on various other environmental issues, and I think increasingly also social justice issues, because all these things are very much entangled. And I suppose there's two sides to our work, which I think are both important and sort of mutually reinforcing. So I think the first side of the work is literally just working out how the arts and culture sector can have a better environmental impact. So essentially reducing emissions, which is something that's really key, something that we do have to work on and think about. So considering things like international touring and what that means in terms of travel emissions, thinking about the buildings that we run, many of which are old heritage buildings which are not energy efficient, and how we can kind of preserve that heritage while trying to ensure that those buildings are as low carbon as they can possibly be, and sort of doing that quite technical work. That's the side that I don't work on, which is not to say it's not important, it's not what my colleagues work on. The other side, which I think comes out of that, is really thinking about the role that arts and culture can have in influencing the much broader transformation that we really need to see in order to address climate change in Scotland. That is, it really does need to be a transformation, I would say. It's not something that we can fiddle around the edges of. It's something that really involves changing everything about how we operate as a society. And that means things like technological change and infrastructural change, but it also means changes to how we think and imagine. That addressing climate change is not just an issue of finding the right technology. It's also about addressing how we really exist as humans, and how we see ourselves, and how we operate together socially as well. And I think that's an area where arts and culture clearly have a very important role to play. You know, that's the role that they've traditionally had in our society for a long time. So kind of thinking about the role of the arts as a place to explore ideas and to kind of reinvent ourselves, but also thinking about identity specifically, like how we use music as a way of really trying to project a particular idea of ourselves, and how the music we listen to reinforces those things. So I think this is something that arts and culture have a vital role to play in when we think about climate change. So how can arts and culture be mobilized as a way of helping us to imagine new futures, imagine better ways of operating, but also to build a different sense of identity, or a new model that is optimistic and positive, and provides a genuinely new way of thinking that will then allow us to achieve this transformation that we really need to achieve. and in a way that brings in everybody, so that isn't something that's for a limited part of society, but that takes in everyone that needs to be involved, because this involves everybody. So, and I think those two areas are totally mutually reinforcing. So if arts and culture tries to play this influencing role without changing itself, then we're hypocrites. If we only transform how we operate but don't think about our wider role, then we're insular, we're only thinking about ourselves, and we're not really engaging with the real sense of what arts and culture is for. So that second part is a side I work more on. And I think, just to finish up, maybe I should just say a bit about what that means in the context of COP26. So one thing that we decided to really focus on was this issue of participation and access when it comes to COP26, which really is quite a closed series of negotiations that matter for all of us and that are extremely visible, but that most of us don't have an opportunity to really participate in or engage with. And I think we can probably have a debate about how right that is. So we created this project called Climate Beacons, which sought to provide ways for people based all across Scotland to have some way of participating in this moment in various forms. So there are 7 beacons. They're each situated in a different bit of Scotland, and each one is formed of a collaboration. So a collaboration between arts and cultural organisations, so saying that very broadly, kind of including theatres, art galleries, libraries, museums, community arts groups, and environmental organisations, again, very broadly. So research bodies, public bodies, campaigning groups, community organisations. And each collaboration is working in their specific location. So there's one in the Outer Hebrides, one up in the Highlands, Fife, Argyll, Inverclyde, Midlothian, and Tayside. That's a good test of my knowledge. They're all doing extremely different things, but I think the focus on all of them is finding a way to allow people to participate in this COP26 period, which is relevant to that particular area and to those particular communities that are based there, and using arts and culture as a way in, but also working collaboratively. So not just working within ourselves as arts and culture, but being open and working with others who are doing extremely good work and need to be collaborated with. So I should probably stop there, but I'm sure we can drill into this more. That's probably not a good metaphor, actually, drilling later on in the passage.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominic and Molly, for putting this together and for inviting me. I myself am an anthropologist. I teach, as Dominic was saying, at Hopkins, and I have been studying the COP process since 2015, since the launch of the Paris Agreement. But before that, and this might be of interest given the photographs here and the interest more broadly, not just in mitigation, but also in adaptation, I work with a community that lives on effectively moving islands, silt islands, in the middle of the Brahmaputra-Jamuna River in Bangladesh. And I have been studying the area since, I think, 2011, just trying to understand how it is that people live with moving land, and how things like, inheritance or social life or political life is even possible if the village that you call your home is constantly on the move, as it were, breaking down, being reconstituted, etc. And that research is at its end now, but I'm going to go back at the 10-year mark, because climate scientists really consider 10 years as the kind of chronotope or the temporal marker to be able to really tell if a particular kind of change is not just a sort of random change because of the weather system of that year or and so on, but actually is permanent climate change. And so I'm going to be going back next summer, just to sort of look at how the villages that I've been interested in tracking all this time, how it is that they are now finally talking about something at the register of something permanent. Because when I was doing research with them at the start of the decade, what was clear is that they live with so much physical dynamism that it was very hard to tell the ticker of time in terms of climate change within it. So the question for that project has been, if you live with this kind of dynamism, how do you even know that something is climate or something is permanent? permanent at that scale. And the project that I'm doing now, which I'm completing, and I have a book coming out which looks at the climate process, is really trying to understand why the global south is even interested in engaging this process, given that it's so skewed towards the global north and towards mitigation in particular, and mitigation being a specific sort of burden of the industrialized countries, right? So most of the countries that we're talking about that are part of the process are actually not countries that have even made the mark in terms of industrialization. And so you will hear very often in the hallways that climate change is not of our making, and that's because they weren't part of the Industrial Revolution, and nor they ratcheting up to such a scale that they are going to be a significant part of the problem anytime soon. And so my question for that project has been, why are people from the global south involved in this if they're not part of the problem? If the problem is so clearly about 20 countries, why don't they just get together and work it out amongst themselves? And I have a variety of explanations for why, but at least from the perspective of Bangladesh, and I'll just say this very briefly, it's very interesting that it's not climate at stake in the process always, right? A lot of it has to do with maintaining some sense of one's sovereignty, especially if you are a vulnerable country or a poor country or least developing country. You have for decades relied on development aid or are very reliant still on aid to come. And so to have something like a site where your sovereignty matters and is actually protected within the UN principles, allowing your vote to be as consequential as that by, say, United States and so on, makes this a process which is very alluring to countries of the global south, because they feel that, as opposed to other kinds of processes, either within the United Nations or outside of it, such as international trade treaties, etc., where they have a much more marginalized position, this is one in which their voice counts. And then, of course, the very important thing is that, for many decades, many of these countries were indebted to industrialized countries through the IMF, World Bank, bilateral relations, etc. But this is finally a situation where industrialized countries are indebted to them, where these countries have to do something to mitigate their own past and their own current practices. And so it feels to them that this is a space in which, they are finally in the receiving end of what they feel for years they've been, sending out to the world in terms of what they owed on debts and so on. So those are the two reasons that I find that global south countries in the global south are interested in staying part of the process. One, because of sovereignty, and the second, because of the sense that climate debt finally evens the playing field a little bit, right? So I think I'll just stop there. I mean, I could just go on and on. As an academic,
Come back to that.
Yeah.
So thank you very much to our three guests for their outline and their work there. I think that, to come back to the core theme of this exhibition and this installation here, is that there are very valuable contributions to be made by humanities and social sciences to the debate around climate change, but also to the solutions on climate change as well. And I suppose I have a question to all three of you, actually, which is, bearing in mind that you all come from actually quite radically different backgrounds. So I know that, Lewis, you have a background in sort of music and performing arts as well. There's a huge push all across academia and all across, all of universities to find relevance in climate change and to be seen to contribute to it, because obviously, there's funding, there's very much a political, sort of politically in vogue issue, which it should be, but also that there are genuine contributions to be made here as well, using these perspectives. So I wondered if each of you, speaking from the perspective of literature and kind of arts and music, and also as an anthropologist, which is a discipline which not everybody knows about, actually, speak about the particular roles that those disciplines could make to understanding and ultimately fighting climate change.
Just a small question there. I mean, I'll try to kind of like contain it a bit by thinking about the Nature and Wellbeing project, and then if I spiral out, then at least I'll have like some foundation to go back to. So I was interested in that as a literary person, because what we do really well in literature is get obsessed with language. That is like our work, not just kind of classifying words, but looking at histories of words, looking at the kinds of discourses or the kinds of knowledge and histories of knowledge that are kind of bound up in the language that we use. So in my literary work, I come under the umbrella of eco-criticism, which is like ecologically minded literary criticism. And we could talk all day about nature, just that one word, nature. The benefits of using it, the downsides, whether a word like ecology might be better, the problems with language of environment, the way that language kind of separates us from the world and also brings us near to it. So the nature and well-being world, for example, when I became interested in that, I would go along to conferences and often events where there were practitioners, people who might offer woodland therapeutic sessions for somebody with a mental health diagnosis, or who had been kind of referred there by a doctor. I would go to these events where people like that were meeting to talk about their work, and people would assume that I was either a mental health service user or a practitioner, and I'd say, no, I'm a literary person. And people would say, why the hell are you here? What are you doing here? And yeah, sometimes in that world, the language of nature is used quite like unreflexively. It's often kind of portrayed as this kind of green and pleasant separate realm. I think I sort of suggested this in the introduction, that we kind of go to heal, and a place kind of without a politics of its own, a place without kind of trouble of its own. And as a literary scholar, I can see the way that in the 18th century poets started sort of celebrating nature, and in Britain, at least in Romanticism, and portraying it like that, this kind of quasi-spiritualized realm of like otherness that could heal us, but that we had some kind of almost moral obligation to. And the practitioners would be like, what is the hell of the use of that for me? Sorry, I'm just trying to get some funding here to help somebody in a forest. But actually, like, when you look at the way that those practices or those kind of healing tools were valued in society, actually those kind of older constructions of nature sometimes act to their detriment. Sometimes it kind of helps people pigeonhole those therapies as like a bit hippy dippy, like a bit naive. So yeah, the language we use matters, I guess. Even this week I've been thinking about COP and the language of fighting the climate crisis. Why are we creating the climate crisis? The climate crisis is something that is produced by industrial systems and economic processes. There's nothing to fight. It should be a process of healing, restoration, repairing, facing. And as a literary scholar, I think that we can just stop and pause and look at the kinds of relationships that are bound up in the language that we use, and kind of help facilitate, participate in the process of changing language, knowing that language makes other ways of relating and doing things possible, or at least kind of easier to imagine.
So I was asked to talk about music and the performing arts. I suppose I have a lot of thoughts about that, but maybe I'll try. Maybe I'll also focus it on one thing. So maybe, I guess one thing I think about a lot is about collaboration. So I suppose I do a lot of trying to exist between two different worlds. So I go into the musical world, and there are lots of musicians there who are really concerned about climate change and really feel like they ought to be doing something, but find it very difficult to get a sense of what their role can be. That I think when a songwriter thinks, I'm going to write a song about climate change, suddenly it feels quite tricky. And what do you say? And how can like a genre like the pop song encompass everything they want to say about climate change in 3 minutes? And we might well ask, where are all the pop songs about climate change? There are very, very few for one of the kind of the premier issues of our time, when there are so many about other pressing issues. So I think that's something that sometimes we feel constrained by the conventions of our own field, and that can be very hard to get outside of. And then I think similarly, when I go into the kind of the climate campaigning world and the advocacy world and talk to those people and say things like, well, have you considered the arts and have you considered music? It can be very difficult to draw that connection as well, because those people who are thinking about very specific policy documents or kind of timelines and data and figures, and sometimes music can feel like a distraction in that context. I think that kind of when there's so much important work to do, how can we create space for music? Which is not to say there aren't people in those fields who really do appreciate the role of the arts, but I think those are the people I suppose I really have to seek out and find and work with. And I think again that's a case of there being a particular field with certain ways of thinking that we need to find a way to get out of. And I think the way to do that is to work together much more actively and find ways of collaborating that really work, which I think is not easy. I think there's definitely projects I've heard of which involve things like an artist coming together with a researcher, and there's so much goodwill and they really want to work together. But actually sometimes that process doesn't really get anywhere because it's quite tricky. Two completely different fields, different ways of thinking, different languages. It's actually quite a long process to build that understanding. But I think when it really happens, it's so exciting and it kind of really creates a big change. And I think maybe I'll just highlight a couple of projects which I think have been really beautiful examples of this. So there was one project which is still ongoing around COP26 called Let It Grow, which involved the writing of a new song. So the singer-songwriter Corinne Polwart wrote this song about climate change, and with quite a strong focus on Glasgow itself as well, which I really liked. And then they basically just put the song out there into the public domain and invited other musical groups to take ownership of it and produce their own versions of it. And they worked a lot with community organizations and campaigning groups to get that word out and kind of find the right way of expressing that. And I think I've really seen that being taken on. So kind of like street bands have done their own versions, and community choirs, a hip hop group did their own version. There was a heavy metal version. It kind of became something that people could suddenly have themselves. And I think it came back maybe to what I was saying about identity, that there is something about music and the way we use it and listen to it and the way we're surrounded by it when we listen to it, which really affirms our sense of self, I think, somehow. And when we can kind of perform our own version of a piece of music and find our own voice in it, I think that's a really powerful thing, which then makes us suddenly feel like, oh, actually, I'm someone that does have something to contribute to this, and then I think can take forward into another place. And I think we're seeing that happen with that project. And it's so difficult to express that you can't quantify that value, or maybe you can, and some clever person is working out how to do that, because that would be quite handy, but maybe you can't. And I think, yeah, you sort of just have to keep trying to find new ways of doing things, I think. And I think, yeah, this way of working between two different fields and thinking between two different fields, I think is something which I think is bearing fruit for a lot of people.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Anthropologists, well, if you don't really know what anthropology is about, then maybe I'll just give you a little sense of what anthropologists have been doing in this field. So if you think of it in terms of an evolution, I would say that anthropologists started off by being concerned about climate change because they were witnessing it in their various field sites, given that they tend to sort of leave their homes and go elsewhere. And elsewhere doesn't mean like a foreign country necessarily. It could just be there around the street in a neighborhood with which you are not as well acquainted. So anthropologists were really in some ways talking about the front lines of climate change, whether it's in urban contexts or rural contexts or agricultural communities or water fights, land conflicts, dispossession around fights over resources and so on. So you really get a whole generation of anthropologists writing about these things and being involved in them very actively. As climate change really got entrenched as a thing in the world that scientists verified and said existed, and people started to take more seriously, I feel that the anthropologists sort of switched their focus. They were still working on the grounds, but became very interested in the knowledge structures and became very interested in understanding who's setting them up, who's in them, what's expertise, what counts as legitimate knowledge, how is knowledge excluded, and so on. And so that's why you have anthropologists in this process trying to understand it, not necessarily just sort of, saying rah, rah, continue with the process, but trying to think critically about it, think about, about who is there and who's not. I think that increasingly, though, anthropologists are starting to occupy the same sort of space that we're hearing about here, which is trying to think about how we can think about climate change not only as something that's out in the front lines there, or as climate change being erected as a policy problem or a political problem in centers of power and so on, but try to think about how climate change can be thought of as something that requires society to think otherwise, right? To be otherwise, to do everything while also keeping climate in mind. So one way, a parallel I like to draw is that, for years and years we existed the way we were, and suddenly women were like, women are excluded, no, they don't get to vote, or no, and they get to do all the household labor and get no money for it. And suddenly gender came into view. And then if you think about race, that's how race came into view as well, through fights on the ground and so on. And I think climate is like that. Climate is a very contested term, and that the only way to really come to terms with it is to bring it into your perspective in everything you do, as something that has been occluded or neglected or excluded, and now it's time to not. And so I think that's what I would say about what anthropologists are trying to think about now.
Thanks very much. That kind of brings me to a point about sort of, I suppose, the purpose of humanities and aspects of social sciences that relate to humanity as a whole. We're in a situation where we are being confronted with the idea of humanity as a global force, through the Anthropocene, which, for those of you who aren't maybe familiar with the term, is the idea that we have reached a point at which humanity's impact on the environment is complete, and that we are the dominant force in shaping global geological and ecological systems, for which there is a great deal of proof. And I remember when I was actually at the Carsten Center in Germany, a colleague said, well, the clue is in the name. Humanities is about humans, and when humans are the problem, humanities are the answer, which I think is probably quite a good way of looking at it. And likewise, anthropology, the word anthropology comes from anthropo. We talk about anthropogenic climate change. There is an obvious connection there. In your own engagements professionally with the climate process, with the climate debates as well, which we all touch upon, how much of an understanding do you feel there is for the human element, as you've just touched on there, Naveeda, when there is a huge emphasis on the science and everyone waits for the assessment reports and everyone waits for the scientific consensus, which has been established for quite some time, broadly speaking. How do you then, I suppose, justify or how do you try and engage with the fundamental aspects of engaging with human society in your work?
This is quite a topical question for this moment, because I've just begun, I'm 4 weeks into my teaching term in Bath, even though I'm here. And I teach a third year module, which is on writing and the environmental crisis. And the students for that produce a blog. So I've already read all their blog posts. I know what they think when they come to the module, and I can track what they think at the end of it. And their first blog post always is something along the lines as, isn't it terrible that humanity has destroyed Mother Nature? And as a lecturer, I pick apart every single word of that sentence. Who is the we, right? When did we do this? Mother Nature, okay, we can talk about the gendering of Mother Nature, particularly within within British culture, for example, where there's a big eco-feminist critique of that kind of language, although I know other cultures use it in a very different way, with less of a stark gender binary behind it. But yeah, the really, really critical idea, I guess, is that not every person has done it, right? Specific cultures, specific societies at particular moments have done it. Global North, post-industrial, capitalist societies. And it's the way that we kind of help them understand that is through looking at literary texts from the early 19th century through to the 20th. So they look at things like Charles Dickens, they'll look at hard times, literature about factories, what was happening in industrial cities. We look at novels written in a Brazilian context, South American context, looking at kind of extractivist cultures and what's happened to the rainforest. And we kind of open up this human story, or human stories, of what it looks like to live with a complex ecosystem in a very damaging way, in an extractive way, where you're taking from it and not giving back. And then we'll also introduce them to literatures which show very different ways of relating to the living world, through character, through story, through kind of language. And what they learn is that there isn't just one way of relating to nature, which is like humanities' way, that, you know, that our understandings of nature have changed, and so has the human. The human isn't a stable category. Like, there are obviously things that bind us, and those things are really important, but cultures have changed radically, and they can change again. And I stick with literature as a space to show that, because you can do it really quickly. You know, you get people to read 6 different novels, and they've seen 6 totally different worlds in 6 totally different times, and gone on like just an incredibly deep, very emotional journey, where they've kind of lost themselves and seen what it's like to be a different self and relate to the world in a different way. So yeah, I stick with literature, whether it's novel, fiction. Lyricism can do it as well, but as a space to kind of to open up that question of kind of how we relate and how we might relate differently, and how people have related differently in the past.
Yes. What do I think? So yeah, I suppose what I think is I'm interested in the way that we as humans aren't rational beings, for better or for worse. And I'm inclined to say for better in many ways. I think that's kind of where art comes from in a lot of ways. But it's not the case that we just look at the data that's provided with us and say, oh, here's the necessary action. And we've seen that playing out, that the climate science has been there for a long time, and yet to many people's confusion, commensurate action has not taken place. And I think this is something that people who work specifically in climate change communication talk about a lot. It's like, you can kind of put out this information that shows very clearly that like a certain, you know, you provide the data, you demonstrate very clearly that it needs to lead to this type of action, you put it out into the world, and then it sort of sinks without trace. And why does this happen? And that, you know, this applies to communications that's aimed at like policymakers just as much as it applies to members of the public, that we don't really operate that way. I don't think we don't just absorb the data and change in a way that matches up with that. We have our own strange ways of operating, which I think the humanities can speak to in a lot of ways. And I think we do need to see things humanized in some way. So the climate crisis is something that's very hard, I think, to really conceptualize, maybe impossible to kind of fully conceptualize within our brains. So I guess a classic way of formulating this was a writer called Timothy Morton called it a hyper object. So an object which is sort of so complex and strange to us that we can't really contain the idea of it within our brains. So we need to find a way into it. And I think one way of doing that is to really look at individual human stories, which I think the arts can speak to very well. So kind of showing what it is actually like for someone on the front lines of climate change, or on the front lines of fighting against deforestation or other forms of extractivism, and really seeing that for ourselves and really relating to that on a personal level. I don't know if there's any substitute for that. And I think the arts can be one way of doing that. So kind of through storytelling, through photography, through films, those, I mean, it's kind of incredible that we live in this period where we're able to do those things. You know, kind of 100 years ago, you couldn't have access to things like we have now. Like just yesterday, I was at a film screening of a film that was made in Colombia by Colombian environmental activists who had been provided with film equipment and put together this film, which is now being screened in Glasgow. And it's absolutely incredible that exists, and that, you know, that we have this almost portal into other people's lives that they can communicate with us so directly. That's such a powerful force that, you know, it's kind of incredible that that's not used more, I think, because it's such an amazing thing. And I think that's something that really does make me want to change and to take action, really seeing another human telling their story and seeing or trying to see the world from their perspective. I think that's something that we need to all devote more time to, I think, and the arts are one way of doing that really effectively, I think.
I got busy drinking. This conversation is very heady. Human. So a couple of things. In anthropology, again, using anthropology as my frame of reference here, but not necessarily exalting it or extolling its virtues. So in anthropology, the shift has been to be more suspicious of the figure of the human and to try and decenter the human and to go into what has come to be called the post-humanities. And so there's definitely a lot more interest in thinking about animal-human relations, thinking about our relationship to inanimate matter, and so on. I'm not entirely in sync with all of that, because at the end of the day, I think you still need to rely on the very, human edifice of the mind, your body, etc., to even perceive these things. Material relations or relations with animals still have to be mediated through the human body. And so as a result, my own work has been very much to think about how do we decenter the human, but still acknowledge that the human is very important as a means to understand or relate to nature, to animals, to material objects, etc. And so a thinker that I have read a lot and who I use quite a bit, it's a very strange, odd choice, is actually an 18th century philosopher, the philosopher Schelling, who has been really important for me in terms of how to think the human in a continuum with even all the way to matter, right? And to think of it as obviously an evolution of some kind of consciousness, but not to necessarily transvalue it as higher, right? And so Schelling has been very important for the work I was telling you about earlier in the Brahmaputra, because there are some very interesting resonances between the community I was working with and Schelling's articulations of what it is to be the thinking object for nature, to think of our thoughts as not belonging to us, but as nature's expressions through us. And how do we actually think of that ethnographically, which is the way in which anthropologists write, which is through empirical material, through conversations, observations, etc., has been what I've been thinking about. The second thing, in terms of the climate crisis and how it is that one makes common cause with other species, other humans in other kinds of contexts, more and more recently, I've been thinking about the theme of the household. I mean, it's something that's just does not appear in the climate conversations at all. But I was thinking that, household, we all household, whether we household by ourselves or we household with others. It seems to me that this could be a very capacious concept by which to think about making common cause with others. So, for example, in the context of the US where I live, the only conversation you ever hear about climate change is how do you reduce your carbon footprint, right? How do you have a less wasteful lifestyle? How do you make good green consumer choices? All great. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that kind of insight doesn't actually give you insight into the field work that I was doing, right? You would almost always encounter that as an other. Whereas if you think about the struggles of the community I was working with, for instance, in terms of householding, and think that I do the same, right? And think about the fact that householding right now has two peculiar elements. One is how to live sustainably, but also simultaneously to think about the world that you're in, no matter how secure it is, as one day being unlivable and one day possibly nearer to the future or a little farther away, right? That's the conjoined thinking that we're doing right now, which is we're both trying to live sustainably and thinking about how we might live in a world that isn't any longer familiar to us, whether it's here or somewhere else, right? Through displacement or resettlement. If you think that that's what you share with people all around the world, then you're more likely to have, as it were, a time machine or some sort of, prism by which to link your experience with that of others. I don't know. Those are just the things I've been thinking about.
Thanks very much, Naveeda. And I've got one very brief question to each of our guests before we open it up for the audience to ask some questions. And so on Monday, when we were setting the exhibition up and moving into the space, about 2:30 in the afternoon, the police came round and shut everything down, and the whole of this 1 square mile of Glasgow was turned into a ring of steel so that prime ministers and presidents could go and have dinner at Kelvin Grove Museum. And we were not consulted on this, it's fair to say. A lot of people were saying, well, you can't do this. This is totally against the spirit of the COP. You're shutting down one of the most creative parts of a city, which is famous for its people and famous for standing up to power as well, actually. If you could have been inside that reception and had 5 minutes with these people to say something and just to say, look, you're doing it wrong, like you need to engage with these things, what would you say?
How long do I have? This is very, thank you, pertinent for me, because I was staying in a hotel. I was lucky enough to stay in a hotel right there. And I was very caught up in that lockdown because I was trying to get across the park. Like in 3 different moments in that day, I was trying to get across that park. And all of my work is about green space and mental health, right? And parks are like the spaces in cities we think of as the essence of nature where you can go and restore yourself. And they have a really complex history because they were invented to deal with urban crowding, to deal with like factory conditions in cities where people's health is really declining. So parks are already kind of implicated in histories of unwellness and unfairness. Access to green space is already like hugely circumscribed depending on class and particularly race in British cities as well. I basically spent a lot of time stumbling around that park. I got kettled in the park at one point because they randomly shut the gates on one side. I had to climb over a gate to get out during the daytime. I know, it was ridiculous. And another time I had to get through it in pitch black at night and with obviously very serious conversations going around women's safety in city space and in natural space. I felt very hard done by that situation. I know other women who were stuck in the park did too. So I would say to them, like, space is political, right? Place is political. If you want to have this conversation, the people who have the knowledge are outside. They are excluded. You are not creating a space that lets people in. You are turning a city into a fortress. One more thing on that. This morning I was very honored to walk with Laminga Indigena, group of indigenous delegates, primarily from South America, along the river to kind of take them or kind of go with them to the entrance of COP26. I think about 150 delegates were supposed to be there. Only about 30 got visas even to get into the country. Only about 2 or 3 people actually got into the space. Those are the communities with the solutions, right? Those are the communities who are the most affected, and those are the communities who have the solutions to the problems that have been created by a very broken relationship with the living world. And they are not in that space. So I would say open up the doors and unlock the gates.
Yeah, I think in terms of what I would say, so I think firstly, I don't believe there is something I could say in 2 minutes that would actually lead to significant change. I think it's about ingrained value systems, and I think those take work to change, and I think that takes time. I don't think there is an intervention I could make in 2 minutes that would lead to a significant change. But I think what I would say is maybe similar. I think I would say, let's go outside the fences, and let's go and talk and hang out with the protesters who are all the way off in the middle of the park because they couldn't actually get any closer to that and see what they have to say. Because I think, I totally agree with what you've just said, that I can see why they want to put up fences, because obviously there maybe is a potential risk of a bomb threat or something like that. But I think just the messaging of the whole thing is totally wrong if you're creating a sense that there's people on the inside whose voices matter and people on the outside who don't matter or need to be kept out. And I think the most powerful thing that someone in that space could have done would have been to make the deliberate choice to go outside and feel what it's like to be on the other side of that fence, but also to speak to and listen, and more importantly, listen to the people who are on the other side of that. And maybe that through that experience, that might be something that could be more transformative than anything I could say being in that formal space in there. Yeah.
I've been to 6 of these, and I'm hoping this is the last one, because the book is written. I've done whatever I could do about this process. But one thing I've noticed about it is that it's heavily reliant, the nature of each of these are heavily reliant on the presidency, which is different from the process itself. The process is sort of like in its own time vacuum, right? It's just continuing on, and it happens even outside of the COP or throughout the year. But the presidency really shapes the experience of the COP. So, for example, the first one I went to was Paris. Paris had just been bombed by ISIS, and so there was martial law in the country, right? And not in the country, in the city, and so we couldn't even have a climate march. And you really were in this very peculiar situation where you were in the sort of birthplace of like modern democracy in some ways, 1789, and then there were, riot gear, police everywhere, right? And then, the other one that was terrifying was in Poland, in Katowice, where for every marcher, they had probably 2 police, right? And the police were non-communicative. So you couldn't actually go up to them and say, which way is the march? Because they wouldn't even look down at you, right? It was terrifying. And so in a way, it's a weird, the COP becomes a way to realize something about our world, which is we're far still too dominated by the nation state process, right? Even though capital travels and that, the market economy, etc., has made the world into some kind of one unity, when it really comes down to such things as the climate negotiations, the nation state keeps showing up and showing its ugly face and its violent nature and its concern about security, etc. I really think that if we need to do more, we have to, it's very intrinsic and important to the climate process to have the nation state be important, because as I said earlier, it protects the smaller countries and the weaker countries and so on. But if we don't start thinking outside of this nation-state process, this process won't change. The process doesn't have any ability to change by itself. It's entirely nation-state driven, right? So unless we can change or think outside of this framework, I don't know, I don't have any ways to just, secret tips to that. I'm not sure that we will see ever a change in Biden in the way that he comes, or the way Boris Johnson calls for a world's leaders summit, when people just need to get on with the negotiation. He held up the negotiation by 3 days with his photo op, and it's terrible, right? And that's why you are in the situation you are. So.
Thank you very much to our speakers. I'm going to turn this microphone off now and open up the floor to anybody who has a question. Either about the general topics we covered, or specifically for the expertise of any of our guests. Yeah, gentleman over there.
Yeah. What has something to sorry, I hear names one time and I'm so senior, I can't remember my own name now.
That's my excuse too.
I'm 10 times remember. So, is it Naveeda, yeah? Naveeda, right, Naveeda. I've really been enjoying everything you have to say. It was great listening to you, especially about that kind of from the horse's mouth stuff about Bangladesh. And I'm thinking about that relationship, global north, global south, and what you're saying about how people in the global south feel about that. It's great to hear, and we should hear a lot more about that here. We just don't do enough about that. And I'm thinking now about recent, I suppose we call them Western thinkers, of which you are one, I presume. So, right, and the kind of attitude to that stuff. I'm thinking of the definition of global south and global north that has been given by a lot of thinkers up now, and I'm thinking particularly about people like Boventura, Susan Santos, and maybe also, I don't know where I got this from, I've got it in my head, maybe like, what's his name, Barbier, what's his name, the French philosopher, and Emily Apter, linguist and stuff like that. Anyway, their idea is that global south is not a geographical concept, which seems to be directly opposite of what you're saying. And that global south is something that's global south and north are marked through one another. And of course, when we think about the position of black people, disabled people, queer people in this society as being marginalised in ways that are similar, I suppose that's what they mean. And also peasant economies that are not far from here, the Western Isles of Scotland is a peasant economy, so and will also be affected by, we just probably saw an article today about Orkney going to be affected by, it's not that's the Western Isles, it's the Northern Isles, but will be affected by the sea rise and so forth. So, what is, given what you just said, which I found really interesting, and we need to hear a lot more from the global south, how do you feel, or how would you place, or what would be your opinion or reading of these Western intellectuals who are saying, but global north and global south are not geographical, they are, marbled to one another across the planet.
This is very interesting.
Right.
Thank you. On our way over, we were looking, my student Perry Maddox, who's here, who works on Panama, he was just showing me an article that talks about decolonizing ecology, which was in a fairly mainstream journal. And this term decolonizing, I think, attends to the spirit that you're talking about, which is, let's really just think about the fact that everybody in every context can point to instances of colonization, which isn't necessarily captured by a nation state for the purposes of whatever, right? Imperialism or extractivism or whatever. So, and there has been a widespread of this concept of decolonization, right? So I think that what you're saying really points to that, in the sense that it really points to the fact that we need to think out of the geographical location of global south, global north, and I'm very sympathetic to it. Yet at the same time, I want to be able to not have that be fully captured by, for instance, just to give you an example. I saw Kerry yesterday, who is, the US envoy for climate change, and he was talking to the 47 least developed countries, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and he was talking about how he acknowledges that the US is part of having contributed to the problem, and they, of course, the US, along with every other industrialized country, will take responsibility, etc. And then, of course, they were held up because of Trump, but now they're back on course, and they're going to, do so much, but we can do 65%, but the remaining 35% has to be done by other countries, i.e. China, I won't name names, he says, all of that, right? And then at some point he says, and you know what, we're all vulnerable, right? And then he starts to cite examples from the US, such as wildfires in California, flooding in New York City, and then, freezing in Texas, right? And I thought it was an incredibly interesting move, because on one level he's saying, there is no one privileged place, right? Bangladesh can't claim to be the victim, or Papua New Guinea, etc., all of these island nations, right? Everybody is suffering. So in that case, we are all in the same boat together, right? But at the same time, he's also deferring or kind of misplacing responsibilities, saying that we're now all in the same place. So, please don't look to America to be doing something for you when really we have our own people to look out for, right? So it's a really tricky position, right? Where you can both make a claim for the global south in terms of historically what we've associated with it, but also by extending the concept to a wider population of marginalized marginalized, disenfranchised people, you can draw attention to the fact that there are inequalities within industrialized countries, but it can also be so easily captured, right, by somebody like Kerry to sort of get US out of that situation. So I think we have to think about this contextually every single time, right? I don't think we can have a blanket position on this. So I don't know, that's a very long answer.
No, that's
Sorry.
Was there anybody else who had a question? Yeah, just
Thank you all for it was really stimulating all those fascinating ideas about language, music, and anthropology. My first question is for Naveeda. As you see in the developing countries which are affected the most, and as you said, there's a realization as well, they're exploited by the global north, people feel that way. But what we see, their action of those communities and those countries that people are living in, there's a feeling or there's evidence, there's a less realization of climate change. They're affected the most, but there's a less realization in terms of how to get, or how to get on with the solutions which are needed. Here we see in the developed world, people are floating ideas, making zero emission zones and going very, very developed ideas, but in those developing countries, we don't see those efforts. But we see why there is no realization. Do you find any factors which really contribute into that kind of thinking of those communities?
So I'll just give a response by analogy, right? In the sense that in the field where I work, right, everybody is very, very poor. As I mentioned, they live on moving land, etc. And they're not particularly religious, right? They're all Muslims, but they're not religious at all, right? But yet they consider themselves to be the best Muslims ever. So I finally asked, I was just on what grounds? You don't pray, I don't see you being particularly nice to others, charity, etc., etc. And they were like, it's because we suffer. Do we need to do anything more? We just suffer, right? And suffering means that we excuse the prayer and the purity, etc., who has time to be constantly bathing and praying, etc., right? So I think it's a little bit that situation in different parts of the world. In a country like Bangladesh, they say, climate change is possibly here. Everybody's telling us we're in the eye of the storm and we suffer, etc. But meanwhile, at this immediate moment, we are energy poor, right? We have no sovereignty over our food, right? And so it's in terms of temporal scales, there's the immediate, there's the near future, and there's the far future. So you worry about us as being climate victims. We'll meanwhile worry about just getting food in our stomachs, right? So it's not really, I don't think we really have to be concerned about making sure everybody's at the right level of consciousness to be at climate change. I think that we just each do what we can at whatever stage we are at, right? Whatever temporal horizon we are oriented towards. While the suffering is a paramount. If suffering is very clear for us to witness, I think. I don't know if that's an adequate, it satisfies you?
It does, yeah, it does. The conscious level, I think that puts responsibility on this developed world. When we claim we are being exploited in the past, that kind of we are not that developed, we are disadvantaged communities, we cannot think at that level, the conscious level is not that, we are not that aware. I think that these kind of ideas should come up, put into if you're claiming the West or the developed are exploited us through industrialization and post the whole thing, they've achieved things, they developed their human beings, and kind of it was helpful. One question for music one, it's quite interesting. Arts, I have heard many fascinating ideas. One of my colleagues, she's doing PhD, she's trying to promote peace in Colombia through arts, the music. And I've seen her PhD, totally mind-blowing ideas. She has she really achieved a lot. Her PhD had real impact. She went ahead, she started music small concerts in the areas where the gangsters used to have, like, it really became peaceful when they started all these things. But when we see the musicians and the stakeholders, when we think like we need to include the major faces like pop stars, they really can facilitate the process through music. The climate change isn't that in terms of like they have their own commercial life as well. As a pop star, you're producing it when it comes to an entity as well. And when you are doing something like something for cause, climate is like, does that like make them contradictory? Like once they are singing a song for climate, and people like perceive like okay, but the face is like how, but the singer is saying like what kind of lyrics, and kind of it gives musicians the identity, and the next day they are doing something else like it's totally against who goes against the ideas of climate. You know, does this the commercial thing and the working for cause is kind of we need to look at it? Like these are still kind of we can treat them as a bad news.
Yeah, I think it's a question that's coming up more and more, and that I think people around me are asking is kind of how are we able to operate as climate conscious musicians or creatives or art makers within the art industry as it currently exists, and are these things compatible? I think a lot of people are feeling like it's not, or it's not at least not facilitated by the industry as it currently exists, where there's certain very heavy expectations about what you need, what you ought to be doing, and what is desirable and what constitutes success. So I think in the world of music, often the idea of success is that you're jetting all around the world and you're putting on kind of concerts with kind of massive light shows and things in huge venues, and then you're kind of jetting off to the other side of the world to something somewhere else, and that's the gold standard. And obviously that's an exaggerated idea, and that's not what everyone is doing. But I think there is this sense where there is a pressure that to prove that you fully arrived, you have to be operating internationally, you have to be operating on a certain scale, and it's quite tricky for people to find a way to have the income they need to survive as a musician, which can be very difficult without subscribing to that model in some way. And obviously there's the music business as it exists, which is very hard to exist outside of. And I know there are lots of really great eco musicians who are trying to kind of plough their own path and find their own way of doing things. And I think that is becoming more possible with new models that are coming to exist, mainly because of the internet and what that facilitates. But I think it's still very, very difficult not to buy into that industry in some way. In order to get your kind of climate conscious music out into the world, you kind of have to work with a label, and then is that undermining your message itself by being part of that machine, and will that mean that your message ultimately rings hollow anyway? So I think I don't have a good answer to that. I think that's something that a lot of people are struggling with at the moment.
I'd like to bring Sam here, if I may, because I mean, Sam, you've written quite a lot, obviously, in current work about not just so obviously the idea of wellness and the idea of nature as a cure, but also kind of the way that the cultural market works around that as well. Like, it's definitely a theme in your work, and in Britain and in other countries, there is very much a thing similar to the music, which is the idea that certain writers and certain cultural figures have actually managed to make a career out of lamenting the loss of nature and writing these very kind of public statements and protestations of their love for the earth and everything else. And there's been a big pushback against that in British literary circles as well. I wondered if you could just pick up on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you were saying that, actually, I was thinking that's something that rings true for politicians. I've heard conversations on the radio, kind of people who like maybe aren't that engaged with COP, but who are like watching what's happening and saying, oh, well, Biden's coming with all these cars, like this person's flown from there. And there's this kind of hyper scrutiny on anybody who, is a politician who travels, but also anybody who kind of stands up for environmental issues. And there has been for a really long time, whether they're actors or writers, any kind of public figure. And you get into this peculiar paradox where some people's behavior is kind of hyper politicized, and the question of hypocrisy becomes really, really fraught. And I worry about that. Like, I think that people do need to be held to certain standards, and to not behave in like willfully hypocritical ways. But then also it's that case of kind of individualizing the problem and holding these people up as figures of kind of fun or fraudulency, as opposed to looking at the wider issues and actually where kind of carbon outputs are actually coming from in society, which are much more structural. In terms of writing about nature, there's a kind of strange, so my book is like kind of nature writing based around like travel and going to different healing environments and looking at that question of the human at the center of it all, and the fact that nature is often on the periphery of that, thinking about whether the like forest bathing or different kinds of wellness retreats, whether they're actually just prioritizing a very kind of bourgeois idea of individual wellness, or whether they're actually interested in what is really sustaining and transformative about connecting with the living world and kind of understanding ourselves to be part of it. Which did involve thinking about like, the carbon footprint of like a wellness retreat. But also the way that a lot of the environmental impact of those journeys is obscured. Like a lot of nature writers do travel around the world to like go and see amazing places and kind of report back in order to kind of fill us with a sense of wonder, and never talk about the economics of that, let alone the climate impact of that. And I know in my book, and other writers are more interested in this too as well, trying to make shorter journeys, trying to make like journeys that are like less exclusive, elitist, journeys that anyone could make into like local environments, taking trains. I don't know, you don't want to turn it into kind of like eco theater, but then like if we're not thinking about like the material reality of what we're doing, it quickly reeks of bullshit. So yeah, I think it puts you in a difficult place basically, but I do think kind of revealing the obscured material realities of transport behind nature writing or eco musicians or whatever, it does matter, because when there is hypocrisy there, people see it. It's like the first thing they see.
And it's something that your opponents will use to dismiss you. Like it's so easily weaponized, I think.
That's why Greta Thunberg took a boat to get to America, because if she'd flown, it's like she would have been discredited by everyone. She had to do that because of the level of kind of scrutiny she was under. I'm sure she wanted to as well, but like she had to.
Sorry.
Thanks everyone. I'm so enjoying the tone of this conversation. All the contributions have been so spot on. Thank you all. I have a question maybe for Lewis first, but welcome general feedback about valuing these collaborations between the humanities and sciences and conservation. This is something very close to what I'm working on myself, but it comes out of a workshop I attended recently where different examples of arts and science collaboration were being shown to those working on environmental, like land management projects, and as kind of examples of good practice. And out of that workshop, someone who worked for a nature Scot said, I can see this is all very valuable, but I don't think that we can ever really embed this unless we can put a kind of carbon number on the kind of impact on these projects. Like, unless you can tell me how much someone's carbon has reduced as a result of seeing this artwork that resulted from this collaboration, I really don't think it would be, because everything I do in my whole job has a carbon value to it. And this is something all the artists on the panel were at great pains to talk about how you can't judge these projects on the same terms, but I think it's very difficult for individual artists to keep making that argument. It's very exhausting, and I wonder, from your work at Creative Carbon Scotland, how ways of creating a new frame of reference in terms of valuing these collaborations and projects, how that can be developed en masse so that it doesn't have to be individually rehashed over and over.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something I struggle with on a daily basis, basically. This is something that plays on my mind very much. I think it's such a key question that I think you're totally right that the things that the arts have to contribute to addressing climate change so often are intangible things that it seems like it's impossible that there could be a way of measuring this, that it's things that I think are really essential, like kind of what I was saying earlier about kind of finding new ways of thinking and imagining and relating to each other, which we really need to do. How can you possibly come up with a metric that can really show those changes have definitively taken place? You sort of have to trust in the process. At the same time, we can't just say, oh, we're artists, we believe that the change is happening and therefore it must be fine and therefore you should give us money to do it. And that's not acceptable either. So I think there has to be some way of meeting halfway. I think that we have to make an open-hearted and fair attempt to try and engage with that way of thinking in terms of trying to do the carbon footprinting and think about like what impact that might have been and try and do a bit of calculating insofar as it's possible, even if it's kind of everything's in brackets and kind of saying like this might lead to this and kind of just mapping out the sort of theory of the change, I suppose. But I feel like we, if coming from that perspective, need to fully engage with their way of measuring in order to expect them to fully engage with our way of measuring. And I think it's only once we've been through that stage then we can find the middle ground which will be able to account for both these things, because I think we do need each other. I think like lots of artists want to engage with climate change, but just don't have maybe the knowledge grounding that's really necessary to do that in the most effective way. So, and I think obviously, we need to have that. At the same time, as I've discussed, people working in climate change are kind of constantly frustrated by the fact that their attempts at communication and putting the data out there don't lead to the expected changes. And I think the arts are something that does fill that gulf, that will kind of help for them to achieve the things they want to achieve. So I think we need to find that middle ground, and I think we can only do that by, I think the best way maybe of doing that is kind of going all the way to each other's own ground and then finding the place in between, and I think that's where the understanding happens from. And I think that takes a while. And as for that, I guess the last bit of your question was about whether there's like a consistent way we can do that. I think, again, the answer I think is yes and no. I think each project is unique and needs its own approach, but I think there is certainly really vital work to be done in academia, I think, trying to create some models that we can use for thinking about these things that can then be put out there and then at least use as the basis for lots of different projects to kind of have that consistency as well. And I mean, maybe the research is out there and I just haven't found it yet. I haven't found it, and I wish there was more of it. Yeah.
The temperature in here is rapidly dropping. And well done to my guests for trying to sit relatively normally whilst obviously being absolutely freezing. It seems like a good place to round off, and particularly what Lewis was touching on there, which is this idea about finding relevance whilst resisting instrumentalization, which is something that is core to the work of I think everybody here, and also a lot of our contributors here at the exhibition as well. We are here for the entire COP, so until next Friday when we conclude with the writers David Farrier and Carl Flynn in conversation, talking about their respective books in an event looking at humanity's legacy in the long term and the world after us. In the meantime, we're here every day. Please do come by, look at the exhibition. Please come by and view our film in the afternoons. I'd like to thank SGSAH once again for sponsoring this event, and obviously thank you as an audience for attending and asking many, many good questions, and also to people who are watching us on the video as well. All of our contributors are Googleable, I believe. So if you want to know more about them, you can find them on the online. And I'd just like to thank you once again for attending, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the COP and that we all achieve a positive outcome next Friday.